All right, good evening. I'll go ahead and get started. It's a little after 7 o'clock Mountain Time. Welcome to Buddhism in a Nutshell. This is a 5-week course that is intended to provide a very broad level overview of basically everything that the Buddha taught is something that we will touch on, at least very briefly, as it's presented or understood in the Tibetan Buddhist system. We could say this is Tibetan Buddhism in a nutshell. Our center, Tupten Norbu Ling, we're physically located in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we are an FPMT center. FPMT is the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, FPMT. It is a Tibetan Buddhist center, particularly in the Gelug uh, sub-school of Tibetan Buddhism. So that's where everything that we present is coming from. We'll touch a little bit in today's class on how Buddhism is packaged in a global sense, just like Christianity or Islam or Judaism. There are different variations, different packagings of the same teachings. Um, so everything that I understand about Buddhism is specific to Tibetan Buddhism, and our center is specific to Tibetan Buddhism. But what makes FPMT a little bit unique is that FPMT's goal isn't to recreate the Tibetan Buddhist cultural experience for an audience that has an existing cultural link to Tibetan Buddhism. Our goal is to extract the essence of the teachings and present them for an audience that doesn't have that particular cultural connection. You could say a Western audience in that sense. So, there are certain things that we do, of course, that are culturally based. We do some different prayers and different ceremonies. It's not a secular tradition either, but we really try to emphasize the universal philosophical aspects of the teachings that are applicable or understandable to a person who doesn't have that existing cultural link. So, we will be exploring all of the Buddha's teachings in a very, very broad way to give people a sense and understanding, if this is something that they want to pursue further. And if so, what are the best ways to begin studying the teachings in a little bit more of a systematic way, a bit more focused of a way to get more out of the material. So in the first class, we are going to really set the stage. The first class is going to talk about the life of the person who would become the Buddha and to go into a little bit of detail about the teachings, but really we're mainly setting the stage. And then in the further 4 classes, we'll begin to unpack the teachings in much more detail and all of the major topics that the Buddha taught over the course of his life will be touched on to some degree. All right. And because at the moment there's just the two of us, I can't technologically, I can't spotlight my video. So if you do have your camera on at some point, and then you ask a question, you'll get recorded. Um, Otherwise, your voice will get recorded regardless. But just so you know, for privacy reasons, if you wanted to keep your camera off, I can't prevent your video from getting recorded unless somebody else joins. Did you have any questions so far?
No, no, I think everything is pretty straightforward.
All right, so we'll get started. Okay, let's see. So, yeah, the meditation here, where it says meditation we'll talk a little bit. There is a different course that we actually just did, Meditation 101. It's another one of the introductory courses. If you are interested in that, if you're interested in a course that's dedicated to Tibetan Buddhist meditation, that is the main companion course to this one. We do have a version, we have the version of it that we just did recorded on our YouTube channel, and also past versions as well. Um, okay, so this is kind of just a broad description of what we will be discussing in the four courses, the 5 classes, the 4 remaining courses or classes, as well as tonight's class. All right, so we'll just begin with thinking about, what our interest is in attending the class, what brought us here. Um, and of course, the descriptions here, there's 3 different descriptions of the idea of motivation. Motivation is incredibly important from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. Tibetan Buddhism, as we'll see at the end of tonight's class, fits into the global pantheon of teachings as what's called a Mahayana tradition. And there's Mahayana and Theravada are the 2 main traditions. And so the goal of the Mahayana tradition is to achieve full enlightenment. But of course, and by the end of the course, you'll have a reasonable understanding of what's meant by that. But broadly speaking, just at the outset of the course, um, if you already have done some study, if you've already have some familiarity with these ideas, then of course you can set that kind of motivation. But broadly speaking, just try to think about what brought you here and what might it mean for your life and for the lives of others if you were to, gain more skills, more knowledge, more abilities, um, more capacity to use spiritual teachings to benefit others, and just think that that's primarily, what your interest is. It isn't just for oneself trying to have a motivation, where we also think about putting what we learn into practice in our lives to be of benefit to others. All right, welcome, Mary Jo. Nice to see you. And um, yeah, all right. So as I said in the first class, we will talk because Buddhism are the collected, is the result of the collected teachings of the historical Buddha. We begin by talking about the historical Buddha. That is where all of the material that we practice within Tibetan Buddhism comes from. So the Buddha, the word Buddha, as we'll see, is a title. And so the Buddha was not born as the Buddha. The Buddha was born as Siddhartha Gautama. He would become known as the Buddha later in life. But the Buddha, the person who would become the Buddha, Siddhartha, was born. This image here is a rendering. It's not a photograph, but it's an artistic rendering of what is called the Maya Devi Temple, which is a place that you can go in Lumbini in present-day Nepal. Lumbini in present-day Nepal was the birthplace of Siddhartha Gautama, and the Maya Devi Temple, which exists there now, was erected on what they believe to be the location of his birth. Maya Devi refers to his mother. Um, and so, as it says here, Siddhartha Gautama was born in approximately 563 before the Common Era, so about 563 years before Jesus Christ was born, and was born, as it says, in present day Nepal. At the time, both India and Nepal didn't exist under their current borders. That whole region was a collection of smaller city-states. So, as it says here, his mother was a queen, his father, therefore, was a king. But as I say, we're talking 2600 years ago in this Nepali Tibetan um, region. And so when we say city states, it's much more humble than grand kingdoms that we associate with the Western kinds of French or English or German kings and queens. So it is certainly true that his mother and his father were in charge of a particular city state in this region, but it isn't the kind of grand estate that we associate with more modern kings and queens. And yet it is still true, comparatively speaking, for 2600 years ago, his family was quite, well off as compared to what you would normally find in that region at that time. So he certainly did inherit a life of comparative uh, comfort, comparative ease, comparative wealth. Um, and so there's this story here that it talks about where his mother, sadly did die shortly after his birth, and he was raised by his father, the king. And his father took Siddhartha, very young Siddhartha, to a seer, a spiritual seer, in the local town shortly after his birth to receive a prediction of what would Siddhartha's life be like. And this seer predicted that his life, Siddhartha's, could go in one of two directions. Both were very impressive prophecies or predictions. One was that Siddhartha might follow in the footsteps of his family and take over the ruling of this city state. And if that were to happen, it was predicted that due to his influence, he would be successful in uniting all of the regional city states under a political banner, under the rule of a particular political system. Or it was also predicted that Siddhartha would reject that kind of political life, one of military rule and political rule. And if Siddhartha went in that direction, then he would adopt a spiritual perspective to his life. And subsequently, he would be successful in uniting these city states in the same way, but he would do it through a spiritual tradition rather than a political tradition. And so his father was not interested in Siddhartha having that spiritual approach. He very much wanted his son to follow in the footsteps of the family business of, approaching the ruling in the way that he was doing it. And so his father decided that he was going to isolate Siddhartha and prevent him from learning about the wider world, in order to try to control his decisions and his future. And so, but as we'll see, ultimately, his father wasn't successful in getting him to do what he wanted. Siddhartha did go in a spiritual direction and ultimately would become known as the Buddha, due to that process of his own spiritual awakening. Okay, so for a while, though, Siddhartha was born. He had a childhood in the family compound. He was trained in the arts and the sciences and in politics and in archery and all of the things that were expected of him. And he did marry and he did have a child. His child was named Rahula. Uh, and sorry, I gotta. So that, that did work for a while. He did follow in his father's footsteps for a time. And let's see, am I still here? Yeah, Mary Jo is here. Sorry, I got a crash report and I'm not sure if you guys can
I
still
can
hear.
hear you. I
Okay.
can hear you.
Oh,
Yes,
I don't know what's okay. All right.
I've had trouble with my internet, but I'm on right now. Yes.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. Okay. So, yes, but there did come a turning point when, as it says here, he did go into the town. He asked his charioteer to take him into the local town at a certain point in his 20s. And when that happened, he came upon what are called in the teachings the four sights. So these are the four sights. And really, they represent three different kinds of sufferings. And then they also represent a way of being in the world that rejects kind of the materialistic approach that he had been following his whole life. So he came upon a sick person, and this, we don't know exactly, but it could have been someone who had leprosy or someone who had some sort of, racking kind of consuming disease, where just by looking at the person, you could observe that they were you know, quite affected by their illness. Then he came across someone who just, was in there, just quite frail with age. Someone could be in their 80s. Um, Someone who had lost a lot of muscle mass, who was quite weak, quite frail, and he was in his late 20s at the time, and his father would have been probably in his 40s. So everyone that he had come across was most likely under the age of 50. And so he, the kind of changes, bodily changes that happen in a person's 80s wasn't something that he had experienced. And so he saw this person who was quite affected by disease. And then he saw someone who wasn't, ill, but whose body was being impacted just by old age. And then he saw a funeral procession. He saw a dead body, um, which is quite common even today in that region. They carry dead bodies in open air caskets through the streets, and then so he saw, and with each of these sites, as I mentioned, he brought his charioteer, who was a townsperson who had grown up not in this incredibly sheltered environment. He brought him with him into the town. He had asked him to bring him into the town, and uh, he interrogated his charioteer each time about what he was seeing, and his charioteer kept saying, well, no, this is common. Yes, it's quite common that there are many people who experience this kind of illness. There are many people who experience the suffering that of old age. And then he said, what's going on with this body, this inanimate, dead form? And his charioteer said, well, this happens to everyone. Everyone, experiences at the end of their life, their body ceases and they die. And we've all of us have gone through these same experiences. The difference for us is that we did it, when we were 5 or 6, and we our parents sheltered us and talked us through it and explained what was going on and helped us to process. And he was in his late 20s, and his father had intentionally you know prevented that from happening, prevented him from really understanding what was going on. And so it was quite shocking, when he had to go through all of that, the experience that he himself would experience sickness, he himself would experience old age, and he himself would experience death. And not only that, but everyone that he knows, everyone that he loves, his family, his child, his wife, he was being exposed for the first time to all of these sufferings that are universal in human experience. And it was a very jarring experience for him. And so he became motivated at that time to try to find a solution, to try to do something about sickness, aging, and death, these three universal existential threats that all people face. And then, so he came across then the fourth site, a spiritual wanderer, an ascetic. It was in this region, the Tibetan, the Nepali Indian region. Again, those names and those borders didn't exist, but that general region, there were many existent spiritual traditions that had already taken root, and there were many people who would, abandon their lives and wander to meditate, to contemplate, to seek spiritual knowledge. And he came across one such spiritual aspirant. Um, and this person, being perhaps an advanced meditator, had a way about them. We've all been in the presence of spiritual, people who have some degree of spiritual awakening, some degree of insight into the nature of their mind, and, how they are more at peace and more in tune with themselves. It can be quite palpable, that energy. And so could very well be that this person had some degree of personal insight like that, and Siddhartha was quite moved by being in this person's presence. So he thought, maybe that person is onto something. Maybe if there is a solution to the suffering of sickness, aging, and death, maybe wandering in that way, maybe seeking in that way, is how I myself can be protected from sickness, aging, and death, and how I could explain that to everyone else, how I could share that knowledge, and protect everyone that I know also from those sufferings. And so that became his mission, his goal in life, to try to find a solution to sickness, aging, and death. So then he abandoned, on the basis of coming across the four sites. He abandoned everything, all of his wealth, his lands, his titles, everything, his inheritance, the mantle of governing, all of that he just gave up all at once in order to wander in the same way. And then, so as I said, there were all of these existent spiritual traditions. So he followed what existed in that region at that time, which really emphasized a lot of ascetic practices, a lot of kind of more extreme ascetic practices, where that was the prevailing spiritual view that existed in that region at that time. So that's what he did. That's what he followed for, as it says here, about 7 years, trying to really uncover a genuine solution to the existential threats that sentient beings face. But ultimately, he would find that these existent spiritual traditions weren't fully sufficient in allowing people to get to that answer. And so, what he would discover is there would come a time in his meditation, and you can find, not really in the Tibetan tradition, more so in the Theravadan tradition, they have statues of what is called the starving Buddha. Um, and this is actually still Siddhartha before he had the title of the Buddha. But in following these ascetic practices, he did them as they were meant to be done, as the teachings at the time in that place suggested that they ought to be done. And he got to a point where he was quite near death. And he was trying to meditate on the bank of a river. And because a lot of these ascetic practices involved like standing in running cold water, not eating, not sleeping, the prevailing theory was that if you punished the physical form, then the mind or the spirit could transcend that physical form. And through these austere practices, he lost a tremendous amount of weight and muscle mass and was really quite near death. And as I said, you can find statues of the starving, what they call the starving Buddha. Um, they're just not really part of the Tibetan Buddhist artistic tradition, but you find them in other traditions. But as he was trying to meditate at this point where his body was failing, there was this musician that's depicted in this rendering, floating down the river that he was next to. And this musician was playing some sort of a stringed instrument. And Siddhartha, still Siddhartha, not yet the Buddha, had an insight at that time that the musician's instrument was tuned perfectly. If the strings of the instrument were tuned very, very tightly, then that musician would make a very harsh sound. If the strings of the instrument were very, very loosely tuned, then no sound would come out. It would just be, you know, basically, almost no noise at all. In order to produce the beautiful music that he was hearing, the musician's instrument had to be tuned in the middle between these two extremes. And so he was thinking, well, my body and my mind are my instrument, and I've gone too far. I've, through these ascetic practices, my body, I'm not able to sustain my meditation. I'm not really able to concentrate and do what needs to be done. So he began to eat again. There was this, as it says, there was this appearance of a young woman, and he began to reject these austere practices. He took food, um, and then, the people that his fellow spiritual seekers, they were like, this guy doesn't have it in him. He's not cut out for this, and they kind of lost faith in him as a spiritual seeker because he rejected the prevailing view at the time, and really began to nourish his body in order to be able to meditate. And this is one way, as it says here on the slide, this is what one way of understanding the concept of the idea of the middle way. You've probably heard the phrase the middle way in Buddhism. It has other meanings, but one meaning is finding a balance between austerity and indulgence, right? If we punish the body too much, if we drive ourselves too hard, that will be counterproductive. At the same time, total indulgence, total, laziness, just indolence, sleeping all of the time, doing whatever we want, having no discipline is also an extreme that's not helpful, that will also similarly prevent spiritual realizations from dawning in the mind. So we ourselves, just like the Buddha, we ourselves have to find a middle way. We have to have a certain amount of spiritual discipline, but also we have to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves, that we're sleeping, we're eating, we're resting, we're engaging with our loved ones, we're, having meaningful relationships, all of the things that support and nourish our body and our mind, so that we can have a fruitful spiritual practice. All right. Let me pause here. I have successfully screen or spotlit myself, so it's just my video in the recording. So, are there any thoughts or questions that have arisen that should be addressed?
Um, Venerable, um, may I say a comment, please? Oh, now I cannot hear you.
Yes, go ahead.
Something is, oh, thank you. Um, so that middle way um, between either extreme, I guess that also varies from person to person, I think. And also, some people's scale of austerity is quite different than another person's, and the opulence too. And I guess we just have to kind of draw our own line, but I guess also that's what the help of our teachers and even our cohorts, our people that are in our meditation group together and such maybe help with too, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we all start, in different places. We all have different upbringings, and yeah, and certainly, as you said, we have to judge for ourselves. And I think it changes over time too.
Yeah.
You become more and more familiar with, um, I think you certainly, I think one idea is that we replace, the kind of comfort that we used to get from external things. And when we start to see that we are nourished in a similar way internally, then it isn't austerity. It's kind of more like just sort of a losing interest. Like, oh, this just isn't as effective, or as like I would rather meditate than do, go to, a rock concert or something, because we just find it actually more beneficial, you know. So it isn't like this idea of discipline and so on. I mean, to a certain degree, you know, our minds are untrained and, you know, but, and so certain guidelines and so on are quite helpful. Um, but it's also that we just begin to notice what works and what doesn't work. And I think over time, naturally,
Yeah.
we tend to follow what works, um, more and more. So, I mean, at the very beginning, it's a little bit more external, then I think it becomes more and more internal.
Yeah.
But yeah, and
Yeah.
but we, you know, we do have to judge for because certainly one person, we all have different karmic imprints, you know, in this life, and one person can maybe push a little bit more than another person, and like they're not burning out and it's not, and but the other person, they need to rest more, they need to take more breaks, they need to, you know, you know, and that is skillful, you know. We shouldn't be like, oh well, this person's doing it like this, so I should also do it like this.
Yeah.
We have to
Yeah.
use our own life as a guide and say, well, this is what I can do. And then in 5 years, and what, you know, things can change and we might be able to do more later on. But if we
Yeah.
certainly, if we try to do too much too soon, the whole thing can backfire and we can get a real
Yeah.
aversion to our practice.
Yes.
Any other thoughts or questions?
I like your picture. That's a nice picture of the musician there. I like it. It's beautiful.
All right. So now we're getting to the point where Siddhartha, so we're at the point in Siddhartha's spiritual career where he had this period of asceticism and so on. And then he began to reject that and kind of do his own thing. And it was at that time when it became really productive for him. And now he had traveled. So, as I mentioned, he was born in Lumbini, which is in present day Nepal, just over the border between present day India, present day Nepal. His enlightenment happened at a town in present day India called Bodh Gaya. Um, and so this is a representation of what's called the Bodhi tree. Became known as the Bodhi tree because it was the tree where the Buddha, where Siddhartha became the Buddha, became enlightened. So he had his final meditation under this tree, the shade of the tree he sought, you know, shade under this tree, entered his final meditation and overcame the final afflictions in his mind, um, and became free of all of those negative afflicted states and achieved full enlightenment. Um, and you know, at that, under that tree at that time. And there is still, if you go to Bodh Gaya, there is a descendant of that. It's not the original, because again, 2,600 years, that's not the exact same tree, but there is still a Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya that's a descendant of the, thought to be a descendant of the same tree. Um, so now he becomes known as the Buddha, the one who is awake. That's what Buddha means. Buddha is a title that means the one who is awake. So, what does that mean? So, we call him Shakyamuni Buddha. Um, he was his birth name was Siddhartha Gautama, but he became known as Shakyamuni Buddha. Shakya was the clan that he was born into, which was kind of the warrior class in the region. And Muni means able one, and Buddha means awakened one. So this is the full title that he became known as, Shakyamuni Buddha. Um, so, we are only, as it says here, we only, as an ordinary sentient being, we only have ordinary wakefulness, which is just kind of going through life, as a kind of on autopilot, sometimes, engaging with the world, but also being subject to many drives and states of mind that are outside of our conscious control. And then we'll talk about these other two results of Buddhist spiritual practice, which is liberation and full enlightenment. Liberation is the end of any kind of afflicted, delusional, negative state of mind, and freedom from what's called cyclic existence. And these are all concepts that will become clear by the end of the course. And then full enlightenment is that and a removing of even what they would call the subtle obscurations to omniscience. So, and we'll address what these different results of Buddhist practice actually are as we're going through the class. But at this point, the Buddha is fully enlightened, is a fully enlightened being after this final meditation under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya in present-day India. So he would then go on to spend the rest of his life teaching others and creating. He created an order of monks and nuns during his lifetime. Buddhism at that time was largely, and still is, largely, well, I mean, there's a huge lay, practitioner contingent of Buddhism now, and there certainly were lay practitioners, but it was during his lifetime, it was primarily a monastic tradition, and monasticism has remained as an important component of Buddhism in all of its forms throughout the world. But he did establish that monastic order during his lifetime. So he would go on to teach for about 45 more years. And the written down teachings, his public teachings would become known as the sutras, and then his esoteric teachings would become known as the tantras. And we'll touch a little bit upon the sutras and the tantras in this class, mainly looking at the sutras. Okay. Should I pause again? Are there any thoughts or questions that have arisen?
Well,
Sure.
I I have a hard concept. I mean, always anyway, timing is difficult, but I'm wondering about I have the sort of picture in my mind that he sat under this tree and he stayed there a day or two, but do we have any understanding of, I mean, maybe he was there quite a long time. Uh, do we have any sort of a glimmer into that time frame? I'm just curious.
Sorry. Um, yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I think it was a couple days, I think, his final meditation. But of course, I mean, there's different, I mean, within Buddhism globally, there are different understandings of when his enlightenment happened. It's this presentation um, is not actually the full understanding that is presented in Tibetan Buddhism. There's, I mean, of course, all of the schools, all of the Buddhist traditions agree that he showed the aspect of achieving enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya at that historical time and place. There are Buddhist traditions, and the Tibetan tradition is one, that hold the view that his enlightenment occurred prior to his birth as Siddhartha Gautama, that his mind, because there are many um, there are many indications that his entire life he was an incredibly special kind of person. Um, and from that perspective, his life is presented as a teaching in its entirety. Just like for us, we are born into comfort, we are born into, materialism, and we, in order to strike out in a spiritual direction, have to see the shortcomings of only having a materialistic approach, being overly, indulgent in materialism. So some Buddhist traditions hold the view that his entire life is meant to be understood as a teaching, as sort of a parable for what anyone needs to do in order to adopt a spiritual life. Um, Other Buddhist traditions take it quite literally, and they hold the view that he was ordinary, and that he did actually achieve enlightenment at this specific moment. Uh, so there's different points of view on that. But certainly, um, you know, it, if you look, but it's also true, all of the spiritual traditions also hold the Jataka tales as being an important part. So in the Jataka tales, there are many, many stories of the kinds of spiritual trainings that he engaged in previous lives. So, regardless of, he didn't do anything really in one lifetime. It was a culmination. Whether that culmination took place before this lifetime, during this lifetime, it was still the culmination of an incredible number of individual lifetimes of spiritual growth, that were all necessary to be able to manifest this enlightenment. All right. All right. So the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, he, let's see, I lost. So the historical Buddha, he achieves enlightenment, or shows the aspect of achieving enlightenment, however you want to phrase it, at Bodh Gaya under the Bodhi tree. And then he spends, time in isolation after this, because he has this view that what he's accomplished is just so difficult, so profound, so incredible. Because again, on the previous slide, it talked about the earth. When he touched the earth at the time of his enlightenment, they call that calling the earth to witness his enlightenment. Because of all of his past lives, he was able to see, the clairvoyance, the omniscience that he received with the awakened state was allow him to observe all of the past lives that were necessary to bring him to this moment. And that seemed so overwhelming that he thought, well, who else in the world could possibly really grasp this kind of awakening? So he really wasn't sure, whether he should try to convince anyone else of this. Um, but ultimately, he did decide to teach. He was requested to teach, and he did decide that there were some people who had done enough spiritual work, that he could reach them, that he could help them. And so he did decide ultimately to spend the rest of his life traveling and teaching. And so his first teaching, again, the five disciples, well, the five companions that he had back when he rejected asceticism, who abandoned him, they now caught up with him, and they were like, wow, this, just he was so radiant and so serene, and he had such a presence. They really were like, we need to follow him. We need to understand what happened in his life. How did he, become like this? And they actually became his first five disciples, his first students. They were his companions. They rejected him because he rejected the existing paradigm, and he forged his own direction. And now they want to learn from him. And his first teaching was the teaching on what became known as the Four Noble Truths. Um, and that is really the backbone. The Four Noble Truths is sort of the Buddha's blueprint for everything that he would teach. Every teaching that he would give fits somewhere into the Four Noble Truths. Um, and so that's really something that we are also going to come back to again and again over this course, because really every teaching that he gave is some sort of explanation or further exploration of one or more of the Four Noble Truths. So if we think about, this, the purpose is, that we ourselves really go through this same process. We ourselves, I mean, whether Siddhartha was born ordinary or whether he, was enlightened at some point, he was ordinary, just like all of us. Maybe it was that life, maybe it was a previous life, who knows? But what's the most important thing to understand at this point is that he was an ordinary person just like us, and he engaged in a process. He understood the existential condition that he was facing. He was motivated by that understanding, and on the basis of being motivated, he engaged in a path of concentrated, sustained spiritual effort, and then he achieved the result of that effort, and became enlightened. And he would go on to use the remaining 45 years of his life to show all of us that we can do the exact same thing. And that's what Buddhists are doing. They are trying to walk in the footsteps of the historical Buddha. They are trying to have for themselves all of the same insights that the Buddha had. Because that is the only thing that stands in the way between ourselves and the Buddha, are the insights that the Buddha was able to generate in his mind through this process of cultivating these meditative realizations. Meditation, is a very important part of the Buddhist path, as a way of concentrating the mind on these realizations and having them sink very deeply into the mind. But the Buddha simply was an ordinary person who became motivated to follow a path and applied himself to that path. And then the result of that path dawned in his own mind, and he became fundamentally different on the basis of that. So really, this idea of enlightenment is simply something that nature allows. Nature, we are part of nature, and as an ordinary sentient being, we are part of the natural world. Our body, our mind are simply natural phenomena, and the mind is just a phenomena that is constituted such that if it is trained in a particular way over time, the result of full enlightenment can be generated within that mind. So it's really just simply a choice that is open to sentient beings. We have a choice to follow that training, that process, and achieve that result or not. Just like we can decide, we can decide that we want to learn mathematics, advanced mathematics, or we can decide not to. And, either way, either will become, at the end of that time, we can decide, okay, for the next number of years, I'm going to apply myself in learning advanced mathematics, and then we'll be someone who has done that, or we decide I don't want to do that, and at the end of that time, we'll know nothing about advanced mathematics, and those are two paths that nature allows us to take. And this idea of enlightenment is no different. The Buddha chose to take that path, to train his mind to obtain that result. And if we choose to do the same thing, then that same result is available to us in the same way. All right. Okay, so to go back then, as I said, the Four Noble Truths is the ultimate framework of all of the Buddha's teaching. So the Buddha, so the Four Noble Truths, they become quite advanced really off the bat just with the word noble, right? We think, and this is our first introduction to the fact that we speak English. And English is the only language that I speak and the only language I can read. Um, and so the teachings, if we're studying them in English, they they would become written down, that for hundreds of years they were transmitted generation to generation through oral teachings. Eventually, they would become written down in the Pali language and in the Sanskrit language. Those were the first two written languages. And then they would ultimately become written down in um, Sanskrit, in Chinese, um, in other languages. So, um, so you have the Pali canon and the Sanskrit canon, and then they would become written down in Chinese and Japanese and Tibetan. Um, and we have to study them in English, right? So they started out perhaps in Sanskrit and then Tibetan and then English, or Sanskrit and then Chinese and then English. There are some sutras that are more complete in Chinese, some are more complete in Tibetan, but so they've all had to go through these different translation processes to end up where we can make sense of them, or at least I can make sense of them. And so the words that people picked, they often have a colloquial meaning in English that doesn't really mean what the word means in its Sanskrit meaning, or in the Tibetan meaning. And so if you study Buddhism for years, this will happen to you dozens and dozens of times. And noble is one such example, because the word noble, the English word noble, is a translation of the word Arya, A-R-Y-A. Y-A, Arya. And it doesn't mean a person who is distinguished, in the ordinary sense of the word noble, someone who has nobility or ideas that have nobility. Arya is a very technical word, and it means a person who's had a direct meditative realization of the ultimate nature of reality. And we're going to come back to that concept mainly in the fifth of our five classes. What does it mean to have a direct meditative realization of the ultimate nature of reality? What we'll come to find out is that it's the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice. But we're going to put a pin in it and come back to it and talk about it when we have a lot of time to discuss what it truly means. But an Arya is a person who's had that insight. They become an Arya. They become a noble one. And so the Four Noble Truths can be understood to be the four things that are known to be true to the noble ones. So when an Arya being looks at our world, looks at human existence, they understand the world to be true or to be characterized in these very four specific ways. So these are the four things that are known to be true by the Aryas, which you wouldn't, which you don't, the Four Noble Truths doesn't tell you that, just in the English. But that really is what it is. When you are someone who has that kind of insight, and then you look at the world, you see the world through that lens, through that wisdom, and it changes your understanding of the world, and things appear to you, truths become known to you on the basis of your developed wisdom that is not available to an ordinary sentient being. We look at the world and we don't see it this way. They look at the world and they do see it this way. So we're going to, begin looking at what this means. And so it follows, you can kind of see here how it sort of follows what's thought of as sort of a medical model. In a way that in this analogy presents the Buddha as that what they call him this supreme physician, right? He's sort of looking at what's wrong, diagnosing it, and then providing us a treatment plan. Right. So the first, if we're going to think about it in this medical model way, the first step is we do actually have to recognize that there is a problem, right? If there's no problem, then there's nothing to strive for. If we go back to the four sights, right? If the suffering of sickness, aging, and death isn't a problem, if you're not in need of a solution, then there's nothing to do. You might as well just enjoy your life. Just, don't worry about any kind of spiritual development. Just sort of float and just have fun, right? But if there is, like, if we are not feeling well, we would want to really understand that. If day after day after day we feel terrible, we would be motivated, right, to go to the doctor and get a diagnosis. And we would want the doctor to agree that there is something wrong, right? If we go to the doctor and we say, I'm throwing up, I'm losing weight, I feel just, I can't, I'm staying in bed all day. And the doctor just says, no, it's all in your head, you're fine. stop bothering me, go home, everything, that would be awful, right? There'd be no hope for doing anything. We really want to, make sure that everyone's in agreement that there is a problem. But not only that, in order to get better, the doctor would have to be able to say, this is the cause. Because again, if there's no cause, if the doctor can't say, there's this bacteria, or there's this virus, or there's a tumor, or there's an injury to this organ, if the doctor can't pinpoint, then still there's no hope, right, of getting better. Yes, you might be sick. And in the same way, going back to sickness, aging, and death, many people would say we're just stuck with it, right? There's no reason why that kind of suffering exists. It just does. It's just there. And if it just does, then again, you might as well just kind of enjoy your life. There's again no real reason to try to overcome something that doesn't have a cause to it, that is just sort of causeless, is just sort of inevitable. Um, but still, even if you have a cause identified, and the Buddha does have a cause. So the Buddha, or these Arya beings, they look at our existence and they would say, hey, look, there really is a problem here. The things are not, there are these sufferings, there are these unsatisfactory, painful experiences that sentient beings are subject to. And there is a specific reason why sentient beings are subject to them. But then third, so the first one is a real bummer, right? Where the Buddha is just saying, look, things are, there's all of these sufferings that sentient beings are subject to. Um, we do have to understand that in order to begin the process of being motivated to do something about it. If it just seems like it's baked into experience, then we would just be resigned to it. Um, but we do have to really understand it, and we have to understand how deeply it goes. And then, secondly, we have to understand why sentient beings are subject to it, because that's the only way that we can find a solution that is effective. But third, things are starting to go in a more and more beneficial direction, because the third noble truth, that the third thing that Arya beings know to be true, is that there truly is a solution. There is a way of uprooting the cause of all of these unsatisfactory experiences that sentient beings are subject to. And then the fourth noble truth is that not only is there a cure, not only is there something that we can do, but we actually understand that there's a reliable and repeatable path, a treatment plan, that if we choose to put it into practice in our own life, the result of that cure will arise. It is reliable, it is repeatable, it is understandable, it is something that we ourselves can accomplish. And so, again, if we are applying this to the medical model, we go to the doctor, and the doctor does tests. The doctor agrees with us that, yes, we are sick. The doctor says, you have a tumor, and it's right here. It's this size, it's this type. And he says, this is something that's treatable with, and he says, I've seen many cases of other people who have this exact tumor in this exact place. And I have seen them recover. And not only that, but I myself have done the surgery and given the drugs that result in them getting better. I know exactly what drugs, what surgery, what are the steps. And if you do what I say, if you let me do the surgery, if you diligently follow up with your treatment plan, you also will be like them. You also will be able to be completely cured of this tumor. That's the best. That's what we want our doctors to be like, right? That's the best possible outcome. And so the Buddha, being the supreme physician, is telling us this same thing. He's saying, yes, things are, you are subject to many different sufferings, but it is not causeless. It's not just random. There is a specific identifiable reason, and it's fixable, and I know how you yourself can fix it. So ultimately, the Four Noble Truths become incredibly optimistic. They don't start out that way, but they do end that way. Um, the Buddha doesn't say, sorry, there's nothing you can do. You're on your own. This is just painful. The Buddha actually says, if you follow my advice and you really put it into practice, this result of complete freedom from all of these sufferings will be your direct experience as well. All right. So let me pause here again. Are there any thoughts or questions?
Um, yeah, thanks for explaining the Four Noble Truths in an in-depth way. It was very helpful. Um, a certain thought popped up into my head when we were talking about the goal, as the goal being enlightenment. And I know when the Buddha was doing his thing with the tree and stuff, there wasn't. I don't think there was an introduction to like any psychedelics at that period in time. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Right. Right, exactly. So lately, even in the media, I'm seeing um, introductions to psychedelics, whether it may be LSD or um, 5-MeO DMT, right? And, uh, I've heard of people, not everybody, I've heard of people having not just a mystical experience, but like deep insights where they've had profound shifts. You know, I just wanted to know, like, when it comes to like, what are the views of Buddhism? Like, like, is that something that it views as it being possible to use a substance, or yeah, I just wanted to know what was going on with that.
Yeah, so there's no historical tradition within any of the Buddhist schools of encouraging that sort of thing, or it having a sort of an official or recognized place. Um, the thinking is that it's basically that it's not necessary. I mean, you'll find Buddhist teachers who don't necessarily disagree with the idea that it's possible that a person can get a glimpse of, some capacity of their mind that they didn't know was there, to see beyond, kind of their normal day-to-day experience, and maybe that really motivates them in a particular way. But what most Buddhist teachers would say is that you are kind of at the mercy of something, of a substance that you are not in any way able to control or direct. Um, Many people, of course, have bad trips, right? Nightmarish visions. Some people have committed suicide or accidentally, run out into traffic, right? I mean, all kinds of, jumped out of windows. So it's a very unreliable process. And it really depends on what kind of mindset you have, how prepared you are. Um, Basically, what they would say is you can do all of that just by training the mind. And that is a process that is safe, that you are completely in control of, that there's no dangers with it. If you're going appropriately through it, if you have a teacher and so on. And so they just say that's a better approach, is that there are some dangers, with a drug sort of approach, and you're kind of rolling the dice, and it could end your life in various ways, just the very first time that you do it for various reasons. So it's not recommended. There's no cultural connection to anything like ayahuasca or peyote or anything like that in the Buddhist tradition. Um, so, um, but certainly Buddhist teachers would acknowledge that there are examples of not, they would certainly say that it isn't possible to just take something and the state of full enlightenment as it's understood in Buddhism just arises in your mind. That's not possible. But there are, certain insights that you might be able to have about, the wider perspective that your mind is capable of. Um, but it wouldn't be encouraged. It wouldn't be something that they would tell you to pursue, given the dangers.
Uh, thanks for explaining that. Yeah, that's sort of the risk factors associated with it, right? Like even if you have those pre-existing conditions where somebody could go into psychosis, right? So yeah, you're right. It's actually it's a gamble, sort of, to do that. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So if we go into a little bit more depth on what we mean, of course, um, we know, that um, our lives are often marked by many, many unsatisfactory experiences, um, and what's different here about the way that the Aryas understand this is that it goes to much deeper levels. When they look at our lives, and we'll unpack this more as we go along, but when they look at our lives, they would say that, you know, suffering isn't just found in overt physical or mental distress, but that suffering is found, in all of our experiences as compared to what it could be, in the fully enlightened condition. So it goes to incredibly deep and subtle levels. Um, And then they would say that the cause, and this is something that we'll get more clear on as we go through, the cause is what's called fundamental ignorance. It's another technical marigpa, or fundamental ignorance in English. It's a confusion about the nature of reality. As I mentioned, Buddhists are interested in having a direct realization of the ultimate nature of reality, which replaces the confusion about the nature of reality that we are presently experiencing. When we experience that confusion, the confusion itself generates what are called delusions or afflictions, which are um, which are things like malice, jealousy, envy, ill will, hatred, um, things that, these states of mind that when they arise, we the mind in which they arise becomes unpeaceful, becomes disturbed, becomes agitated. And the actions of the person experiencing those states become unskillful. They become actions that are more likely to harm those around them than to help. We all know that when hatred is arising in our own mind, the things that we do and say to those that are in front of us are not kind, they're not beneficial, they're harmful. And conversely, when deep, abiding love or compassion is arising in our mind, then the things that we say and do in that moment, when that is our subjective experience, they do tend to be beneficial to others. Um, and so Buddhism is about moving from a state of confusion to a state of wisdom, a state of delusion to a state of clarity and awareness. And then we'll talk about karma, which is when we engage in actions that are motivated by delusions, suffering flows from that. Which again goes back to the cause of suffering being karma mixed with delusion that is impelled by ignorance. So then the third noble truth is that it is actually possible to completely cease that suffering and its causes. Um, and so that genuine freedom from suffering, freedom from delusion, freedom from confusion, from ignorance is possible. And there is a path. The Buddha used his whole life to teach what is the pathway that leads to nirvana, individual enlightenment, and full enlightenment. So he taught these two paths. Really, you could say there is a path, or you could say there are two paths that the Buddha taught. He taught the path of individual enlightenment and the path of full enlightenment. Um, okay. So this is just a little bit of detail about when the Buddha taught. He gave his teachings are organized into what are called the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. The word Dharma is the collected teachings of the Buddha. Um, and his teachings are organized into three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. The first turning, as we mentioned, was where he taught the Four Noble Truths. He taught the idea of the nature of reality on a initial level. And the teachings of the first turning became the foundation for the Theravadan tradition or the Hinayana schools. The second turning was at Vulture's Peak, where he taught the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And this was really the basis of the Mahayana schools, like Tibetan Buddhism. And the third turning, where he clarified some misconceptions that arose from the first turning. And this is maybe a little bit more detail than is necessary, but just some some historical information about the teachings of the Buddha. The third turning was where he taught Buddha nature. So Buddha nature is perhaps maybe the most important teaching, where, as I mentioned, there is nothing unique about the historical Buddha. He's an ordinary sentient being. As an ordinary sentient being, his mind, just in the nature of it being ordinary mind, it is suitable to become enlightened mind. Ordinary mind and enlightened mind are essentially the same thing. Enlightened mind just arises when ordinary mind is trained in a particular way. So that's the idea of Buddha nature. We have Buddha nature because we have mind. And even animals have Buddha nature. They just aren't able to train it in the same way that we are. But their mind, they don't have a fundamentally different kind of mind. They're just not in a position to actually cultivate their Buddha nature, whereas we are in a position to engage in a path that really cultivates our Buddha nature. So then these are the three vehicles of that the Buddha taught. I mentioned Hinayana, Mahayana, and then Vajrayana. So the individual vehicle, this is the Theravadan tradition, generally practiced in Southeast Asia. And the result of this type of practice is individual enlightenment or nirvana. And then you have the universal vehicle, which results in Buddhahood, full enlightenment. And this is the type of Buddhism that took root in China, Japan, and Tibet, and Nepal. And then you have the Vajrayana vehicle. Um, and these are the esoteric or tantric teachings of the Buddha that we'll briefly touch on, but this is really mainly a course on his general public discourses. But really, the Vajrayana vehicle is um, it's not a different philosophical system. It is a way of tapping into the subtle energies of the body and mind to very swiftly um, achieve the result of full enlightenment by manipulating the energies of the body and the mind and achieving states of meditative um, concentration that are not possible unless you tap into directly the very, very subtle energies of the body and mind. But if you do that, you can achieve enlightenment much more rapidly. Okay. So this is, okay, so we'll end here. So we've talked about, so if we were to then kind of encapsulate what the Buddha, what his diagnosis and his treatment plan and all of this is ultimately getting at, is that the mind and the body are separate phenomenon, and the mind becomes associated with the physical body at the coming together of body and mind for us in the womb. And this process has been going on beginninglessly. The mind as a phenomenon, as I said, we're just part of nature. Our mind is a natural phenomenon. Our body is a natural phenomenon. But our mind as an energy is beginningless and endless. And so what it's doing is it is associating with forms. And those associations are lasting for lifetimes. And then deaths are happening, and body and mind is separating, and mind is associating with another form. The Buddha, when the Buddha achieved enlightenment, he was able to observe that this is what's happening, that mind is associating with form, abiding in association with form, disassociating with form at death, and then that process is repeating. And for us, we've been going through that beginninglessly. And we will go through that endlessly unless we achieve individual enlightenment or full enlightenment, unless we put an end to the process of mind associating with form again and again and again. when ordinary mind associates with ordinary form, that is subject to many disadvantageous or suffering experiences. If mind becomes trained and mind achieves the state of enlightenment, that is free from all of those disadvantageous suffering experiences. And so the Buddha is basically saying, look, there's door number one or there's door number two. You can keep doing this. You can keep doing what I have observed is the nature of reality, the nature of the conventional nature of things, which is this process of birth and death and rebirth. Or you can go for, put effort into, and achieve the result of full enlightenment, and then no longer be subject to those disadvantages. Um, it's it's just baked into being ordinary that there is this suffering, because of the confusion of fundamental ignorance giving rise to delusions, which create karma, and then that karma ripens as experience. Um, or we train the mind and we put an end to it. Um, and, that is what the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught the nature of suffering and putting an end to suffering. And that is all that he taught, is how to understand suffering and how to understand putting an end to suffering. And so that is what we will unpack over the remaining 4 classes, everything that he, will touch briefly, at least, on all of the major topics. But we are out of time. Are there any final thoughts or questions?
Yes.
Mhm.
Um,
Sorry, I think you muted yourself again.
the first turning, where is that? It happened?
That was at Sarnath, Deer Park. That where he taught the Four Noble Truths.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, I just had a question. So when we talk about minds and how, the goal is to, end the cyclical existence. So, how does this, um, so, so does this mean that in the world, like let's say me and you are talking, that means I have a mind separate from your mind, which is
Mm.
separate from Mary Jo. And each of these minds, I guess they get these imprints and these I guess the hindrances that you were talking about, which we're trying to get rid of. Um, so does that mean so does that because the only thing that I'm having a hard time understanding is if we are projecting consciousness because that's who we are, which if reality is a projection of our own consciousness, meaning that everything is essentially one mind universally, have are we divided into different minds and playing out as separation? Because then, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's no teaching. So this idea of beginningless mind, right? So basically that concept comes from a sutra where the Buddha said, so the Buddha being fully enlightened, um, the Buddha is would be um, would be the kind of being who has eliminated the obscurations to omniscience, right? So the Buddha is omniscient, able to know everything that can be known. And so the Buddha said that I, as the Buddha, I looked back through all, all of existence, and I never observed a first moment of mind. Um, and so from that, mind is understood to be beginningless. Some people say, well, what if he kept looking? Like, I mean, how many trillions and trillions and trillions of years did he go back through? Maybe he just gave up at a certain point, and was like, okay, functionally speaking, it's beginningless because he didn't actually say there is no beginning. He said, I can observe no beginning. Um, so there's no teaching on like something happened and then minds were created. So there's no teaching in Buddhism where there's some event and from that event minds resulted from that. However, minds are clearly presented as being individual, as having unique histories. So my mind, as you said, so my mind before this birth, the mind that I'm using now was associated with a different form, right? And there was a lifetime with that association. But that association began with a birth of some sort. And so then there was a previous lifetime. And that chain is beginningless. And it is unique to my mind. So, I was me, and then I was this, and then I was that, and in each of those lifetimes, that form just had the one mind, right? This form just has the one mind. The form before it just had the one mind. And so it's a chain of these lifetimes that are unique to my one specific, what they call mind stream, or mental consciousness mind stream. That is a history of births and deaths that is unique to just this one mind. And you are exactly the same. You have your own unique chain of rebirths that is quote unquote beginningless, has no observable, definable starting point. Um, so what that means is that when you achieve enlightenment, I could very well still be completely ordinary. I could still be subject to all of this. And, when I achieve enlightenment, then, I'll be like, hey, nice to see you again. We're now both enlightened. We've now both done that. But it could happen at different points in time, separated by eons of time, um, because each individual mind stream is unique, has its own chain, its own independent chain of rebirths. Now, mind being fundamentally of the same nature, um, which we'll start talking about in the next class. I mean, it does mean that when two minds both achieve enlightenment, they've now both done exactly the same thing. They are now both fully enlightened minds. They're now both Buddhas. And so at that point, it's kind of like there is almost like there is a merging of what's called like the Dharmakaya mind, right? Like the mind of all of the Buddhas. um, where because and so at that point there really isn't. So what is illusory then, you could say, is because mind is an energy. So you could say that the view that I have that my mind is separate than from your mind, that isn't ultimately true, but because of fundamental ignorance is operating in my mind, I'm not able to actually operate from that perspective. I'm blocked from that. I gain that ability once fundamental ignorance is completely uprooted from my mind. But so, in one way, you could say separateness is an illusion, but it is enforced by what is true, which is that mind arises with fundamental ignorance, and fundamental ignorance is present in every moment of mind. And so that is what isolates mind. That is what keeps mind having this narrow, this is me, I'm separate, you know, my personality, my kind of isolated, individualistic view, the ego, you know, it's self-reinforced by the fact that mind arises together with ignorance. When ignorance is removed, then at that point you could kind of say that there is a merging, but there isn't anything to suggest in the teachings themselves that there was some sort of like downfall, or everything was great and then something happened, and then sort of there was a fragmentation. um there isn't that kind of idea.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I'm glad you went there at the end, because that's sort of what I was trying to understand actually. So, um, the I guess the follow-up question only would be, because when I look at like maybe these, I'm sure you've seen these non-dualist teachings, right? Where they basically, they see right through the illusion that the mind is simply making up the fact that there are two minds, which is what you spoke about, the illusory nature. So when it comes to the non-dualists, when they're saying that, hey, um, you know, you're make the mind is just trying to make something up in order to keep the self alive, to create the illusion of separation. But once that's seen through, it was never that to begin with. That was simply a story you were telling them. So do you do do, do Buddhist people view, like, because these non-dualists, a lot of them have never even touched a book of Buddhism. They don't really, they call that even a story as well, in some sort of sense. Now, would it be correct, in order to view these people as some sort of stream entries, or fully enlightened, or like, how does that get justified into what's going on with that scope?
Well, I mean, the Buddha, just discovered for himself a way of training the mind, that is reliable and repeatable. And so, there doesn't, it certainly could be done in other ways. Um, in terms of full enlightenment, as we'll see, there has to be this idea of, wanting to do it in order to be of benefit for others. That kind of aspiration has to be present, um, in the mind. So, I mean, I can't say that there aren't other packagings that lead to a beneficial result, if because the Buddha basically does say that, that the ego is, I mean, I guess it would depend on how a person goes about deconstructing the story, what methods they use. you know I would say that Buddhists would also agree that the path, and that there's a conventional level to that has to ultimately be, that it's just useful, right? That it's not necessarily ultimately true. Not everything is ultimately true, but that it is a useful vehicle. It's a useful way of thinking that leads a person to the correct kind of insight that they need to have. Um, so certainly I mean, the the Buddha and all of the other Buddhas, they came upon these truths in their own investigation. So I can't deny that it's possible to do that in other ways. Um, but it would just really come down to exactly what are the methods, what is the understanding, how is it done? Um, because there could be a mistake somewhere where it could lead to something, but it may not actually lead to exactly the same thing that the Buddha is teaching. Um, you know,
Right. But they would say that the leading is actually misleading because there's nothing that's going from one place to the other, that even that would be seen as a story, that there was never really any sort of like, because the non-dualists, they don't think, I mean, because yeah, because in the Buddhist tradition, yes, you have to do a lot of things to gain the insights, right? There's like a, I guess, sort of like a methodical process that's involved. But the non-dualists are saying that these stories I mean, the it may be helpful, in sort of creating conditions or circumstances for you to gain the nature of the nature of true reality. But in terms of like the radical non-dualist, I mean, it's pretty much stated that you even created a story that you needed to go towards a Buddhist path in order to get somewhere, to realize that you've never even gotten there. Not to say that you know what I mean? Not to say that it's not useful, but sometimes that's just the way things are, you know?
yeah, but I mean, I guess the question is if your goal is to address a population of ordinary people, and you want to get them to a place where they're having this insight, what framework is the easiest, fastest, most reliable, most repeatable, most dependable way of leading them to that? Um, I think that's what the Buddha was trying to do. I think he was saying, I can't just give people a kind of vague, I have to actually step by step
Right.
show them what, step one, step two, step three, in
Yes.
order to get to this place. And how do I do that, given that there's so many different kinds of people, different dispositions, different strengths, different weaknesses, what is on a population scale, what's going to work for the majority, what's going to work most often. Um, and I think that was kind of where he was
I
coming
see.
from.
I see that does make sense, because that step by step methodical process, sometimes it is needed by the masses, right?
Hmm.
For them to actually gain some sort of traction, rather than somebody just saying, "Hey, let go of this entire story," which is also something that can be obtained, but maybe, yeah, but yeah,
But
the
if you
only
freak
thing that I,
people out, if they
right,
freak out,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah. The only thing I would argue is I don't think they have the goal of helping out. I think you were talking about the Buddha, of helping out the rest of humanity, because I think that would also fall under like, hey, that's just you having a goal where you can play that out, but there's no necessary uh, for you doing it like this. You know what I mean? So yeah, yeah. Thank you.
right, all right. Well, so we've got four more classes, and we'll continue unpacking all of these ideas. And yeah, so hope to see everybody again next week, same time,
Yeah,
and have a great week.
awesome. Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
teachings. Very
Thanks for
thoughtful.
coming.
Thank you.